The gates stand silent now. The smoke has long stopped rising from the chimneys. All that remains is stone memory and the echo of a dream that cost everything. Imagine the biggest, most beautiful house you've ever seen. Now multiply that by 10. Picture 110 rooms spread across 88,000 square feet, 39 chimneys reaching toward the sky, carved wooden walls that took years to create, stained glass windows that paint rainbows across marble floors when the sun hits them just right. This is Meadow Brook Hall, and it looks like it's been standing for 500 years, like something a king from England would have lived in centuries ago. But here's the twist. It was built in America, in Michigan, less than 100 years ago. And the woman who built it didn't start her life in a palace. She started it behind a typewriter, working as a secretary in a dirty, noisy factory office. Her name was Matilda Dodge. Remember that name, because what she did and what happened to her family is one of the most dramatic stories in American history. It's a story about climbing from nothing to everything. It's about building something so magnificent that people still can't believe it's real. And it's about losing what matters most, right when you think you finally won. Before we go any further, if you're the kind of person who wants to understand the real stories behind the mansions, the money, and the mistakes of the wealthy, you might want to stay. These stories take time to research, time to tell properly, and the fact that you're here reading this means you're looking for something deeper than just headlines. The year is 1900. The place is Detroit, Michigan. If you walked those streets back then, your nose would burn from coal smoke. Your ears would ring from the sound of hammers, engines, and men shouting over machinery. This wasn't a pretty city, it was a working city, a city where fortunes were being made from metal, oil, and sweat. Detroit in 1900 was nothing like the Detroit you might know today. It was exploding with energy, with possibility, with the kind of raw ambition that changes the world. Every day, new factories opened. Every week, someone invented something that had never existed before. The air itself tasted like iron and coal dust. The streets were muddy from horse-drawn carriages, mixed with the first experimental automobiles, coughing their way down the avenues. This was the Gilded Age, the time when America was transforming from a farming country into an industrial powerhouse. And Detroit was the heart of that transformation. The city was filled with immigrants from Germany, Poland, Ireland, all looking for work, all hoping to grab a piece of the American dream. The sound of a dozen different languages mixed with the roar of furnaces and the hiss of steam engines. In this chaotic, dirty, beautiful mess of a city, Matilda Dodge grew up. Her father ran a saloon, a bar where working men came to drink after their shifts. She wasn't born rich, she wasn't born with connections. What she had was something more dangerous to the old money families who ran Detroit. She was smart, she was disciplined, and she refused to stay small. Think about what that meant in 1900. Women couldn't vote yet. Most women weren't expected to work outside the home. If they did work, it was usually as teachers, nurses, or servants. The idea of a woman running a business, making her own decisions, having her own money, that was almost unthinkable. But Matilda had watched her father work himself to exhaustion running his saloon. She had seen poverty up close. She had learned that if you wanted to escape, you needed skills that nobody could take away from you. So she went to business college, which in 1900 was unusual for a woman. Most girls her age were expected to get married and have children, but Matilda wanted more. She wanted independence. She wanted to prove she could work as hard as any man. So she learned to type, to keep books, to run an office. And in 1900, she got a job that would change her life forever. She became the secretary for two brothers who were about to shake up the entire automobile industry. Their names were John and Horace Dodge, the Dodge brothers. If Matilda was calm, organized, and proper, the Dodge brothers were the opposite. They were loud. They were rough. They got into bar fights. They showed up to business meetings with grease under their fingernails. John Dodge, the older brother, had bright red hair and a temper to match. He could outdrink anyone in Detroit. and then wake up the next morning to design a car part that was better than anything his competitors could imagine. John and Horace came from a small town called Niles, Michigan. Their father worked in a foundry, a place where metal was melted down and shaped into tools and parts. From the time they were boys, the Dodge brothers understood machines. They could take an engine apart and put it back together blindfolded. They could hear a strange sound in a motor and know exactly what was wrong. They had a gift, the kind of natural talent that can't be taught. But they also had something else. Hunger. They were hungry to prove themselves, hungry to be more than just factory workers, hungry to show the world what they could do. And in 1900, when the automobile industry was just beginning, they saw their chance. The brothers started small, working out of a tiny machine shop in Detroit. They made parts for bicycles at first, then moved on to making parts for the new automobiles that were starting to appear on the streets. They were perfectionists. Every bolt, every gear, every piece of metal that left their shop had to be perfect. Word spread quickly. If you wanted quality, you went to the Dodge brothers. And that's exactly what Henry Ford did. Henry Ford was trying to build a car company. He had the vision, the ambition, the drive, but he needed someone to actually make the parts, to turn his ideas into reality. The Dodge brothers were the best in the business. So Ford made them a deal. They would manufacture engines and chassis for his cars, and in return, they would receive cash payments plus shares in his company. It seemed like a good arrangement. The Dodge brothers got steady work and a share of the profits. Ford got the best parts money could buy. Everyone was happy for a while. The brothers were geniuses with machines. They understood engines the way artists understand paint. And they worked together like two halves of one brain. They built parts for Henry Ford, the man who would become famous for the Model T. In fact, the Dodge brothers were so good at what they did that Ford's cars wouldn't have existed without them. But here's the thing. Ford got all the credit. Ford's name went on the cars. Ford became the celebrity. Ford's face was in the newspapers. And the Dodge brothers were tired of being in someone else's shadow. They were the ones doing the actual work, solving the actual problems, but Ford was the one getting rich and famous. In the middle of all this noise, all this ambition, all this competition, something unexpected happened. John Dodge noticed his secretary, Matilda, the quiet, proper woman who kept his chaotic business running smoothly. At first, it seemed impossible that anything would develop between them. John was married, for one thing. He was also loud, crude, a man who spent his evenings drinking in saloons and his days covered in machine oil. Matilda was everything he wasn't: quiet, educated, proper. She wore neat dresses and kept her hair perfectly arranged. She spoke softly and never cursed. They came from different worlds, but John's first wife died, and he became a widower. And during the years that Matilda worked for him, he began to see something in her that nobody else saw. Strength, real, unbreakable strength hidden behind a gentle smile. She wasn't intimidated by his temper. She wasn't impressed by his money. She simply did her job efficiently and perfectly every single day. And slowly, John Dodge, the man who seemed to respect nothing and no one, began to respect her. In 1907, John Dodge, the rough, loud, recently widowed millionaire, married Matilda Rausch, his former secretary. Detroit society was shocked. The wealthy families who had lived in the city for generations looked down on the Dodge brothers. They thought John and Horace were crude, uneducated men who just happened to get lucky. They were nouveau riche, new money, people who didn't know which fork to use at fancy dinners. And now John had married his secretary, a saloon owner's daughter. They whispered about it at parties. They rolled their eyes. The wealthy women of Detroit's Grosse Pointe neighborhood, where the old money families lived in their elegant mansions, refused to invite Matilda to their social events. They saw her as beneath them, an upstart who didn't belong in their world. They never imagined that this woman, the one they thought wasn't good enough for their social clubs, would one day build something that would make all of their mansions look small. But Matilda didn't care what they thought. Or rather, she cared deeply, but she channeled that hurt into determination. She would show them. not by arguing, not by fighting, but by building something so grand, so magnificent, that they would have no choice but to acknowledge her. First, though, the Dodge brothers had to do something that seemed impossible. They had to break free from Henry Ford. By 1913, the Dodge brothers were making a fortune building parts for Ford. Ford's Model T was selling like crazy. Everyone wanted one. And the Dodge brothers were building the engines and transmissions that made those cars run. But they wanted more. They wanted their own car company. They wanted the Dodge name on the hood, not just on the engine parts hidden underneath. Ford didn't want to let them go. More importantly, Ford didn't want to pay them what they were owed. You see, the Dodge brothers owned 10% of Ford's company. They were part owners, stockholders, and that meant they deserved a share of the profits. But Ford wanted to keep all the money for himself, to expand his factories, to crush his competition, to build his empire bigger and bigger. Ford announced he was stopping dividend payments to stockholders. He claimed he needed all the money to reinvest in the company. The Dodge brothers knew what this really meant. Ford was trying to freeze them out, to force them to sell their shares for less than they were worth. So the Dodge brothers did something that shocked everyone. They sued Henry Ford. They took one of the most powerful men in America to court. Think about how bold that was. Ford was already a legend. He was the man who had made cars affordable for regular people. He employed thousands of workers. He had politicians and judges in his pocket. Going up against him was like going up against a god. But the Dodge brothers weren't afraid. They had right on their side. They were legal stockholders, and Ford was refusing to pay them their share. The case went all the way to the Michigan Supreme Court, and they won. The court ordered Ford to pay them $19 million in dividends. $19 million. In today's money, that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It was a staggering amount. Ford was furious, but there was nothing he could do. The law was the law, but Ford was also smart. He knew the Dodge brothers would keep causing him problems. So he made them an offer. He would buy out their entire stake in his company. They could take their shares, walk away with a massive pile of cash, and do whatever they wanted. The Dodge brothers accepted. Ford paid them $25 million for their shares. Combined with the $19 million in dividends, they walked away with $44 million. In 1919, that was enough money to buy a small country. The dirty mechanics from Michigan, the guys with grease under their fingernails, had beaten the system. They had stood up to one of the most powerful industrialists in America and won. And now they were richer than most people could even imagine. And in 1914, while they were still fighting with Ford, they had already launched their own car company, Dodge Brothers Motor Company. Their cars were different from Ford's. The Model T was cheap and basic. It got you from point A to point B, but it wasn't comfortable or stylish. Dodge cars were built tougher, more reliable, more refined. They cost more, but they were worth it. People who wanted a serious car, a car that would last, bought a Dodge. And the cars sold. By 1916, Dodge was the fourth largest car maker in America. By 1919, they had climbed to second place, right behind Ford himself. The brothers were selling hundreds of thousands of cars every year. Money was pouring in faster than they could count it. Their cars were tough, reliable, and people loved them. The Dodge brothers were famous now, not just in Detroit, but across the entire country. Soldiers in World War I drove Dodge trucks. Doctors made house calls in Dodge cars. Farmers used Dodge vehicles to haul their crops to market. John and Matilda had 3 children by this point: Francis, Daniel, and Anna Margaret. They owned huge amounts of land north of Detroit in a place called Rochester. Rolling hills, streams, hundreds of acres of meadows and forests. They called it Meadow Brook Farm. It was beautiful land, peaceful and far from the noise of the city. John loved it there. He could walk through the woods, listen to the birds, breathe clean air. It was his escape from the constant pressure of running a car company, dealing with workers, negotiating with suppliers, fighting with competitors. John and Matilda began making plans. They would build a house there. Not just any house, but something spectacular. a place where their children could grow up surrounded by beauty, a place that would prove to everyone that the Dodge family belonged at the top, a place that would last for generations. They sketched out ideas. They looked at pictures of English manor houses. They talked about how many rooms they would need, where the gardens would go, what kind of materials they would use. It was going to be perfect. Everything was perfect. Everything was falling into place. John and Matilda were at the peak of their lives. They had money, success, beautiful children, land, plans for the future. They had defeated their enemies and proved all the doubters wrong. And then, in January 1920, tragedy struck with the speed and finality of a lightning bolt. John and Horace Dodge traveled to New York for an auto show. It was supposed to be a celebration, a victory lap. The brothers were at the peak of their success, selling cars faster than they could build them. Orders were pouring in from all over the country. Their factory in Detroit was running 3 shifts a day just to keep up with demand. They were millionaires many times over, and they were only getting richer. The auto show in New York was the biggest event of the year for the car industry. All the major manufacturers would be there, showing off their latest models. The Dodge brothers were going to unveil their newest car, a beautiful machine that they were sure would be a huge hit. But during that trip, both brothers caught the flu. And in 1920, the flu wasn't just a minor illness. The world was still recovering from the 1918 flu pandemic that had killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people worldwide. It was one of the deadliest diseases in human history, worse than the Black Death, worse than any war. At first, it seemed like they would be fine. They were both strong men, still in their 50s, in good health. They checked into a hotel to rest. But the flu that year was particularly vicious. It attacked the lungs, filling them with fluid, making it impossible to breathe. John Dodge died on January 14th, 1920. He was only 55 years old. His brother Horace was devastated. The two of them had been inseparable their entire lives. They had built everything together, fought together, succeeded together. Horace couldn't imagine life without John, and as if that wasn't devastating enough, Horace Dodge died 11 months later in December. The official cause was cirrhosis of the liver, complications from years of heavy drinking. But everyone who knew him understood the real reason. He died of a broken heart. The two brothers who had built an empire together, who had been inseparable their entire lives, died within a year of each other. Matilda was 36 years old, with 3 young children, and suddenly she was alone. The man she had married, the father of her children, the person who had changed her life forever, was gone. And the business they had built together, the Dodge Brothers Motor Company, was now her responsibility. Most people would have crumbled. The company would have been sold off immediately. The dreams would have died with John. But Matilda wasn't most people. She had spent her entire life surviving, adapting, pushing forward, and she wasn't going to stop now. The board of directors at Dodge Brothers Motor Company expected Matilda to step aside, to let the men handle things. After all, what did a woman know about running a car company? But Matilda surprised them. She didn't step aside. She stepped up. For 5 years, from 1920 to 1925, Matilda ran the Dodge Brothers Company alongside professional managers. She did not pretend to understand everything about manufacturing cars, but she understood business, she understood money, she understood people, and most importantly, she understood her late husband's vision. She made sure the company stayed strong, stayed profitable. She approved new car designs. She negotiated with suppliers. She dealt with labor disputes. She kept everything running smoothly during a very difficult time in American history. The economy after World War I was unstable. There were recessions, strikes, political turmoil. Many businesses failed, but Dodge Brothers Motor Company thrived. And then, in 1925, Matilda made a decision that shocked Wall Street and made headlines across the country. She sold the Dodge Brothers Company for $146 million in cash. Let that number sink in. In 1925, that was the largest cash transaction in the history of the world. No one had ever paid that much money in actual cash for anything. It was unprecedented. It was astronomical. It was more money than most people could even conceptualize. To put it in perspective, $146 million in 1925 is equivalent to about $3 billion today. 3 billion. In one transaction, Matilda, the secretary from Detroit, the saloon owner's daughter, had just become one of the richest women in America. Richer than European royalty, richer than almost anyone alive. The buyers were a consortium of investment bankers from New York. They saw Dodge as a valuable brand and wanted to expand it even further. For Matilda, the sale meant freedom. She no longer had to worry about factory operations, about union negotiations, about whether this year's car models would sell. She could focus on what she really wanted to do, build the house that John had dreamed of. But money wasn't enough. She had the resources to build anything she could imagine, but she needed something else. She needed a partner for the next chapter of her life. She needed someone who understood her, who could help her carry the weight of all that wealth and all that grief. In June 1925, 6 months after selling the company, Matilda married a man named Alfred Wilson. If John Dodge had been fire and chaos, Alfred Wilson was calm and steady. He was a successful businessman in his own right, having made his fortune in the lumber industry. He owned forests, sawmills, timber operations across the Midwest. He was wealthy but not flashy. He was a religious man, a deacon in the Presbyterian church. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't chase women. He was quiet, thoughtful, kind, and he was exactly what Matilda needed. Alfred Wilson was tall and dignified, with silver hair and gentle eyes. He had been widowed too, so he understood grief. He had children of his own, so he understood the challenges of raising a family. And when he met Matilda's children, Francis, Daniel, and Anna Margaret, he didn't try to replace their father. He simply became another person who loved them. The marriage was a merger of two worlds, the explosive energy of automotive wealth and the quiet stability of old-fashioned industry. Matilda brought the Dodge millions. Alfred brought respectability, connections to Michigan's old money families, and something even more valuable, lumber. The finest wood in the Midwest came from Alfred Wilson's mills, and they were about to need a lot of wood. Together, Matilda and Alfred decided to bring John's dream to life. They would build the house, the grand estate at Meadow Brook. But it wouldn't just be a house anymore. It would be a monument, a palace, a statement to the world that the Dodge family had not only survived, they had triumphed. It would be bigger, more beautiful, more impressive than anything the old money families of Grosse Pointe had ever built. And it would stand forever. In 1926, Matilda and Alfred traveled to England, not as tourists, but as students. They visited ancient estates, castles, manor houses that had stood for centuries. They went to Hampton Court, where King Henry VIII had lived. They toured Compton Winyates, a Tudor mansion built in the 1500s. They studied Knowle House, one of the largest private homes in England, with its 365 rooms and 52 staircases. Matilda took notes on everything. She sketched details in a notebook. She studied the way light came through stained glass windows at different times of day. She examined how chimneys were built, how beams were carved, how tapestries were hung. She asked 1,000 questions. What kind of stone was this? How were these ceilings painted? Who made this furniture? How did they achieve this particular shade of wood? She didn't want to copy those old houses. That would have been tacky, fake. She wanted to capture their spirit and bring it to America. She wanted to understand what made them feel permanent, solid, real, because that's what she wanted for Meadow Brook, the feeling that it had always been there and would always be there. When they returned to Michigan, Matilda hired the best architects money could buy, the firm of Smith, Hinchman, and Grills, one of the most prestigious architectural firms in the Midwest, and she gave them an impossible task. Build a house that looks like it's been standing for 500 years, but fill it with the most modern technology of the 1920s. She wanted electric lights, but she wanted them hidden in fixtures that looked medieval. She wanted central heating, but she wanted the fireplaces to look authentic. She wanted telephones, but she didn't want to see any wires. She wanted a modern kitchen with refrigerators and electric stoves, but she wanted the dining room to look like something from the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. The architects were excited and terrified in equal measure. This would be the project of their careers. If they succeeded, Meadow Brook would be their masterpiece. If they failed, they would be forever known as the people who wasted Matilda Wilson's millions. Construction began in 1926 and lasted 3 years. 3 years of stone being cut by hand, each block shaped to fit perfectly with the blocks around it. 3 years of wood being carved by master craftsmen, some of whom had trained in Europe and brought their old world skills to America. 3 years of plasterers, glaziers, masons, carpenters, electricians, plumbers, all working together to create something that had never existed before. The materials came from everywhere. Stone was imported from England, the same quarries that had provided stone for actual Tudor mansions 500 years earlier. Oak beams came from Alfred's lumber mills, huge trees that were hundreds of years old, cut and shaped with precision. Iron fixtures were forged by blacksmiths using traditional methods. Stained glass was designed and created by Tiffany Studios, the most famous glass artists in the world. Every detail was perfect. Every corner was checked and rechecked by Matilda herself, who visited the construction site every week, and sometimes every day. She wore practical clothes and sturdy boots, and she climbed ladders to inspect the ceiling work. She got down on her hands and knees to examine the floor tiles. She drove the foreman crazy with her attention to detail, but they also respected her for it. She knew exactly what she wanted, and she wasn't going to settle for anything less. Meadow Brook Hall was rising from the earth, brick by brick, beam by beam, and with every wall that went up, Matilda's new identity was taking shape. She was no longer the poor secretary. She was no longer just the widow of a car maker. She was becoming something else entirely, a matriarch, a builder, the founder of something permanent. The house cost $4 million to build. In today's money, that's roughly $60 million. But if you tried to build Meadow Brook Hall today with all its hand-carved details, its custom stained glass, its imported materials, its level of craftsmanship, it would cost at least $200 million, maybe more, because the kind of skilled craftsmen who built Meadow Brook barely exist anymore. That level of attention to detail, that commitment to perfection, has largely disappeared from the modern world. In 1929, the house was finished. Matilda and Alfred threw a massive party to celebrate. Hundreds of guests arrived in fancy cars, driving up the long driveway that wound through the woods and meadows. They wore tuxedos and evening gowns, fur coats and diamond jewelry. They drank champagne from crystal glasses. They danced in the ballroom under glittering chandeliers while a full orchestra played. People gasped when they saw the house. They couldn't believe what they were looking at. It was impossible. It was too grand, too perfect, too much like something from a fairy tale. The great hall with its soaring ceiling, the enormous fireplaces big enough to stand inside, the carved wooden walls that seemed to tell stories, the tapestries hanging from the rafters, the stained glass windows that made the light dance in colors, the wealthy families from Grosse Pointe, the ones who had snubbed Matilda for years, had to admit defeat. None of them had anything like this. Their mansions were big, sure, but they were just houses. Meadow Brook was something else. It was a castle. It was a palace. It was a statement carved in stone. We are here and we matter. Matilda had done it. She had proven everyone wrong. The snobs who had looked down on her, the wealthy families who said she didn't belong, they all had to acknowledge what she had created. She had built her palace. She had secured her place in history. And at the center of it all was her son, Daniel, her boy, the heir to the Dodge fortune, the young man who would carry the family name into the future. Matilda had built this house for him, for his future, for the family he would someday have. She imagined grandchildren running through these halls, generations of Dodges living here, the family name echoing through the centuries. She didn't know that within 9 years, Daniel would be dead. She didn't know that all her careful planning, all her dreams of a dynasty, would collapse in a single moment of carelessness on a remote Canadian island. She didn't know that Meadow Brook Hall, the monument she had built to family and permanence, would become something else entirely, a memorial to loss, and eventually a gift to the future. But in 1929, standing in her completed mansion, surrounded by guests who couldn't stop staring at what she had created, Matilda didn't know any of that. For one perfect moment, everything seemed possible. The house was finished. Her family was together. The future stretched out ahead of them, full of promise. And then, slowly, inevitably, everything began to fall apart. When you walk into Meadow Brook Hall today, the first thing that hits you is not the size, though the size is incredible. It's not the beauty, though the beauty is breathtaking. It's something else, a feeling, a sense that you've stepped out of the modern world and into another time, another place, another reality entirely. The Great Hall rises 2 stories above you. Your footsteps echo on the stone floor. Your voice sounds small and distant. The ceiling seems impossibly far away, supported by massive wooden beams that look like they were taken from a medieval ship. Afternoon light streams through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that float in the air like tiny stars. There are 110 rooms in this house. To understand what that means, think about your own home. Count the rooms, bedrooms, bathrooms, kitchen, living room. Maybe you have 6 or 8 rooms total. Now multiply that by 15. That's Meadowbrook Hall. But these aren't just rooms, each one is a work of art. The dining room, officially called the Christopher Wren Dining Room after the famous English architect, has walls covered in carved wood panels. The craftsmanship is so detailed that when light hits the panels at certain angles, the carved flowers and vines seem to move, seem to breathe. Experts believe the panels were created by students of Grinling Gibbons, who was the master woodcarver for King Charles II of England in the 1600s. Matilda spent months tracking down these panels, buying them from estates in England that were being torn down. She had them carefully packed, shipped across the Atlantic Ocean, and installed in her dining room. Every meal eaten at that table was surrounded by 300 years of history. The ceilings throughout the house are decorated with plasterwork so intricate it looks like lace. An Italian master named Corrado Parducci created them, a genius whose work appears in some of the most beautiful buildings in Detroit. He would lie on his back on scaffolding, like Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel, carefully shaping wet plaster into flowers, ribbons, cherubs, geometric patterns. Every ceiling is different. Every room has its own personality. The fireplaces are enormous, not decorative, but functional, designed to actually heat these massive rooms. In the library, the fireplace is so big you could roast an entire pig in it. The stone was hand cut to make it look weathered and ancient. Masons would take new stone and beat it with hammers, scratch it with chisels, stain it with chemicals, all to create the illusion that this fireplace had been warming people for centuries. But here's where things get interesting, where Matilda's genius really shows through. Beneath all that old world beauty, Meadowbrook was packed with cutting edge 1920s technology. Every room had electric lights, which was still somewhat rare in 1929. But Matilda didn't want to see light bulbs and electric wires. She wanted the house to look medieval. So the electricians hid wiring inside the walls, behind the panels, under the floors. Light fixtures were designed to look like candle holders or gas lamps, but they ran on electricity. There was a sophisticated telephone system connecting all 110 rooms. You could pick up a phone in the master bedroom and call down to the kitchen, or call the garage, or call Alfred's study. This was incredible technology for the time. Most houses had one phone, if they had one at all. Meadowbrook had dozens. The kitchen was a temple of modern efficiency. Electric refrigerators lined one wall, massive machines that hummed and clicked. There were electric stoves, electric mixers, specialized counters for preparing different types of food. The kitchen staff could prepare banquets for 200 people without breaking a sweat. White tile covered the walls and floor, making everything bright and sanitary. It looked like a laboratory, which was exactly what Matilda wanted. The kitchen was the engine room of the house, and it needed to run like a machine. The house had central heating, delivered through a complex system of pipes and radiators hidden behind decorative grates. In the winter, when Michigan temperatures dropped below zero, Meadow Brook stayed warm. In the summer, cross ventilation and ceiling fans kept the air moving. There was even an early form of air conditioning in some rooms, using ice and fans to cool the air. But my favorite details are the secret spaces, the hidden features that show how Meadow Brook was designed not just as a showplace, but as a home where real people lived. In Alfred Wilson's study, a room paneled in dark wood that smells like leather and tobacco, one of the wall panels is actually a hidden door. If you know which section of carved wood to push, it swings open to reveal a narrow staircase leading down to the basement. Why? Officially, it was for convenience, so Alfred could get from his study to the game room without walking through the public areas of the house. But there's something more playful about it, something almost childlike. Even in their own castle, where they controlled everything, the owners wanted secret passages, hidden doors, private ways to move through the space. The game room itself is fascinating. It's in the basement with lower ceilings and a more casual atmosphere. During Prohibition, when alcohol was illegal in America from 1920 to 1903, wealthy people built secret rooms where they could drink without fear of police raids. Meadowbrook's game room served that function. There was a bar, comfortable chairs, a billiards table. The walls were covered in dark wood, making it feel like an underground club. The lighting was dim and atmospheric. This was where the adults came to relax, to drink whiskey and smoke cigars and talk about things they didn't want the children to hear. The children, meanwhile, had their own wing of the house. Francis, Daniel, and Anna Margaret each had bedrooms that faced the sunny side of the building with views of the gardens and woods. Their rooms were decorated differently from the rest of the house, less formal, more colorful. There was a playroom with toy chests and bookshelves. There were bathrooms designed at a child's height, with smaller sinks and mirrors hung lower on the walls. Matilda wanted her children to feel like this house was theirs, not just a museum where they had to be careful not to break anything. She wanted them to run through the halls, to play hide and seek in the dozens of rooms, to build forts out of furniture, to live. But there was a problem, a subtle one that wouldn't become obvious until later. The house was so big that you could feel lost in it. The ceilings were so high that people looked tiny beneath them. The rooms were so grand that they felt more like public spaces than private ones. Living in Meadow Brook was like living on a stage where everything you did felt like a performance. For young Daniel Dodge, growing up in this palace, that feeling must have been overwhelming. He was expected to be the perfect heir, the crown prince who would carry on the family name. Every time he walked through the great hall, he passed the portrait of his father, John, hanging on the wall. Those painted eyes seemed to watch him, to judge him, to ask, "Are you worthy of all this?" Daniel looked like his father. He had the same red hair, the same quick smile, the same restless energy. But while John had channeled that energy into building a business, Daniel didn't have that outlet. The company had been sold. There was nothing for him to build, no challenge to overcome. He was rich beyond imagination, but he had no purpose. So he turned to the things his father had loved: machines, speed, danger. He collected cars and motorcycles. He loved going fast, feeling the wind in his face, pushing engines to their limits. He was fascinated by explosives, by the chemistry of combustion, by anything that went boom. His mother worried. She could see her son growing more reckless, more wild, but what could she do? He was a grown man. He had his own money from his trust fund. He made his own decisions. By the mid-1930s, Daniel was in his early 20s. He was handsome, charming, and one of the richest young men in America. He could have had any woman he wanted from Detroit's high society. The daughters of wealthy families would have lined up for the chance to marry a Dodge heir. But Daniel, just like his father before him, fell in love with someone unexpected. Her name was Loren MacDonald, and this is where the story takes an ironic, almost cruel turn. Remember, John Dodge had married Matilda, his secretary. The wealthy families of Detroit had looked down on them for it, had whispered that it was inappropriate, that John should have married someone from his own class. Now, 30 years later, Daniel was doing the exact same thing. Loren wasn't from a wealthy family. She wasn't an heiress to a banking fortune. She didn't have connections to old money. She was a switchboard operator, a woman who worked for the phone company, connecting calls for other people. In the social hierarchy of 1930s Detroit, she was nobody. For Detroit's high society, this was a scandal. For Matilda, it was complicated. Part of her must have understood. After all, she had been the secretary who married the boss. She knew what it felt like to be looked down on, to be judged as not good enough. But now she was the matriarch, the guardian of the dynasty. She had spent years building the Dodge name into something respectable. And she worried about whether Loren was the right choice for her son. Did Loren love Daniel, or did she love his money? Would she fit into their world? Would she understand the responsibilities that came with being part of the Dodge family? These were the questions that kept Matilda awake at night, but Daniel was stubborn. He had inherited his father's explosive temperament along with his red hair. When Daniel wanted something, he went after it with total commitment, and he wanted Loren. In early August 1938, they got married. It was a smaller wedding than you might expect for a Dodge heir. Some of Matilda's wealthy friends didn't attend, either because they disapproved or because they weren't invited. But Daniel didn't care. He had the woman he loved. He had his freedom, and he had enough money to do whatever he wanted for the rest of his life. It should have been a happy ending, a young couple in love, with their whole lives ahead of them. Daniel had everything: money, freedom, the woman he loved, a family that cared about him despite their concerns. He should have lived to be an old man, should have had children and grandchildren, should have one day inherited Meadow Brook Hall and lived there with his own family. But fate had other plans. Daniel and Loren decided to spend their honeymoon at the family's hunting lodge on Manitoulin Island in Canada. Manitoulin is a massive island in Lake Huron, one of the largest freshwater islands in the world. It's remote, beautiful, covered in forests and surrounded by crystal clear water. The Dodge Hunting Lodge was a rustic cabin in the woods, a place where Daniel could escape the pressure of being a Dodge heir and just be himself. He loved it there. He could fish, hunt, work on engines in the garage, tinker with machines without anyone watching or judging. It was his sanctuary, his retreat from the world of mansions and expectations and society parties. But Daniel had inherited something else from his father, a love of dangerous hobbies. John Dodge had been known for taking risks, for pushing boundaries, for doing things that made other people nervous. Daniel had that same impulse, that same need for excitement and danger. There was dynamite stored in the garage of the hunting lodge. This wasn't unusual for remote properties in Canada. People used explosives for clearing land, removing tree stumps, breaking up rocks, even for fishing. Dynamite was just a tool, like an axe or a saw. But dynamite is also incredibly dangerous, especially old dynamite. When dynamite ages, it becomes unstable. The nitroglycerin inside can separate, can become sensitive to shock or heat. Professional explosives experts treat old dynamite like a ticking bomb. They handle it with extreme caution, if they handle it at all. On August 15, 1938, just 13 days after his wedding, Daniel found some old dynamite in the garage. What happened next is still unclear. Even all these years later, the only people who were there were Daniel, Loren, and a few friends. And in the chaos that followed, the exact sequence of events got jumbled in people's memories. Maybe Daniel was showing off, trying to impress his new wife and their friends. Maybe he was being careless, handling the explosives without proper respect. Maybe he was just curious, wanting to see how old the dynamite was, whether it was still good. Whatever the reason, he was holding the dynamite when it exploded. The blast was devastating. It ripped through the garage, sending shrapnel in every direction. Daniel's left arm was torn completely off. His face and chest were badly injured. peppered with fragments. Blood was everywhere, pooling on the floor, spraying on the walls. But he was alive, conscious, in terrible, unimaginable pain, but alive. Lorne and the others acted quickly. They knew Daniel would die if they didn't get him to a doctor immediately, but they were on a remote island, miles from the nearest hospital. The only way off the island was by boat. They carried Daniel down to the dock. He was bleeding badly, going into shock, but still conscious. They loaded him into a speedboat, one of the fast, powerful boats that Daniel loved. Lauren climbed in beside him. Someone started the engine, and they roared away from the island, racing across the water toward the mainland, toward help, toward any chance of saving Daniel's life. Lake Huron that day was choppy. The waves weren't huge, but they were enough to make the boat bounce and rock as it sped across the water. Daniel was lying in the bottom of the boat, bleeding, probably delirious from pain and shock. And then something went wrong. Maybe the boat hit a particularly big wave. Maybe Daniel tried to stand up or move. Maybe he was unconscious and rolled. The exact details were lost in the chaos, in the panic, in the horror of what was happening. But somehow, Daniel fell overboard. Try to imagine that moment. Try to imagine being Loren, married for less than 2 weeks, watching her husband, who had just survived a dynamite explosion, who was already dying from his injuries, disappear into the dark water of Lake Huron. They stopped the boat immediately. They dove in. They searched. They screamed his name. But Daniel was gone, pulled down by the weight of his clothes, by his injuries, by the cold water that filled his lungs. It took hours before they found his body. The news reached Meadow Brook Hall like a lightning bolt striking the great hall. Matilda's world shattered, not cracked, shattered, into a million pieces that would never fit back together the same way. She had lost her first husband, John, and that had been devastating. But she had survived it. She had her children, her purpose, her determination. She had rebuilt her life, had married Alfred, had created something beautiful and permanent. But Daniel, her son, her boy, the young man who was supposed to inherit everything, who was supposed to carry on the family name, who was supposed to have children and grandchildren, who would fill these 110 rooms with life and laughter, gone, dead at 25 years old. Not from war, not from disease, but from an absurd, tragic accident that shouldn't have happened, that could have been avoided if he had just been more careful, if he had just left the old dynamite alone. All the rooms she had built, all the plans she had made, all the dreams she had for Daniel's future, meaningless, all of it meaningless. The funeral was held at Meadow Brook. Daniel's casket was placed in the Great Hall, the same hall where just 9 years earlier, hundreds of guests had danced and celebrated the house's completion. Now it was filled with black clothing, flowers, tears, and the suffocating weight of grief. If you've made it this far in the story, you're seeing something that most people miss in stories about the wealthy. The money doesn't protect you. The mansion doesn't save you. And the painful truth is that sometimes the people who seem to have everything are the most vulnerable to losing what really matters. Because when you have everything to lose. After Daniel's funeral, Meadow Brook Hall became a different place. The laughter stopped. The parties ended. The 110 rooms that had been filled with Matilda's hopes and dreams now felt empty, haunted by what should have been but never would be. The carved wooden walls seemed to watch her with judgment. The stained glass windows that had once delighted her now just reminded her of lost time, lost possibilities. The fireplaces that had warmed her family now seemed to mock her with their emptiness. Matilda could have given up then. She could have locked herself in her bedroom and let the house fall apart around her. She could have become bitter, angry at the world for taking her husband and then her son. She could have spent the rest of her life asking why, demanding answers from a universe that didn't care about her pain. Many people in her position would have done exactly that. The grief was that heavy, that overwhelming, that crushing, but Matilda wasn't most people. She never had been. Something began to happen inside her, slowly at first, a transformation, the way ice transforms into water when spring comes. the way a seed transforms into a flower, the way grief can transform into purpose if you let it, if you're strong enough to let it. She began to ask herself different questions. These are hard questions, dangerous questions, because they require you to accept that some things are gone forever, that you can't go back, that you have to move forward even when moving forward feels impossible. The years after Daniel's death were difficult in other ways too. There was a legal battle over his estate. Lorraine, the widow who had been married for only 13 days, claimed a share of Daniel's fortune. For Matilda, this felt like salt in the wound. She had already lost her son. Now lawyers and courts were fighting over his money like vultures picking at a corpse. The newspapers loved it. They printed every detail, every argument, every accusation. The private grief of the Dodge family became public entertainment. People across the country read about it over breakfast, gossiping about the rich family's problems, probably feeling a little bit satisfied that money couldn't protect them from tragedy. $5 million from Daniel's estate. In today's money, that's about $50 million. It was a huge sum, but Matilda kept control of Meadow Brook and most of the Dodge wealth. She won the legal battle. But winning felt empty. What good was keeping the money and the house when the person she had built it for was gone? The 1940s arrived. World War II changed everything. Young men went off to fight in Europe and the Pacific. Factories that had built cars switched to building tanks and planes. Women went to work in the factories, doing jobs that had previously been reserved for men. The whole country transformed. And the era of great estates, the era that Meadow Brook represented, began to die. The economic structure that had supported these massive houses was collapsing. Property taxes increased. Inheritance taxes went through the roof, sometimes taking 70% or 80% of an estate's value. The army of servants necessary to maintain a place like Meadow Brook, the gardeners and maids and cooks and footmen, all found better paying jobs in factories or offices. Matilda watched as other mansions across America were torn down. Magnificent houses built by families who had been richer and more powerful than the Dodges were demolished to make room for shopping centers or apartment complexes. Their carved wooden panels were burned as firewood. Their stained glass windows were smashed. Their histories were erased. She began to have nightmares about Meadow Brook suffering the same fate. She imagined bulldozers tearing down the walls. She imagined the 110 rooms being gutted, the fireplaces broken apart, the carvings destroyed. She imagined future generations walking past an empty lot, never knowing that something beautiful had once stood there. This was a crisis of legacy, a crisis of meaning. If you build something magnificent, something that takes years and millions of dollars and represents your entire life's work, but then it gets destroyed after you die, did it really matter? If no one remembers, if no one cares, if it all turns to dust, what was the point? These are the questions that haunted Matilda in the late 1940s and early 1950s. She was getting older. Her health wasn't as good as it used to be, and she knew she didn't have forever to figure out what would happen to her beloved house. It was Alfred who helped her see the answer. Alfred Wilson, her second husband, the quiet lumber baron who had supported her through the worst years of her life. Alfred reminded her that true greatness isn't in holding on, it's in letting go, it's in giving, in sharing, in making sure that what you've built serves a purpose beyond your own ego. They began discussing an idea that initially seemed crazy, almost impossible. What if they gave Meadow Brook away? Not sold it, but donated it. What if they found a way to make sure the house would be preserved and used for something meaningful? But Matilda wouldn't be herself if she just handed over the keys to some random organization. She needed a vision, a purpose, something worthy of the house that John had dreamed of and she had built. She didn't want Meadow Brook to become a dusty museum where bored tourists shuffled through roped-off rooms, looking at furniture they couldn't touch, being told not to take photographs. She wanted life. She wanted energy. She wanted young voices echoing through these halls again, the way her children's voices had once echoed. And then the idea crystallized. Education, a university. She would donate Meadow Brook to create a place where young people could learn, could grow, could build their own futures. Think about the symbolism of that. Matilda had started her life as a secretary, a woman whose education gave her the tools to climb out of poverty. Now, at the end of her life, she would use her wealth to give that same opportunity to thousands of others. In 1957, Matilda and Alfred met with John Hanna, the president of Michigan State University. They sat down in the library at Meadow Brook, surrounded by books and carved wood and the ghosts of happier times, and Matilda made an offer that had no precedent in the history of American education. She would donate everything, the entire Meadow Brook estate, all 1,500 acres of land stretching from the mansion through forests and meadows and streams, all the outbuildings, the garages, the stables, the guest cottages, the mansion itself with all 110 rooms, all the furniture, all the art, all the stained glass, all the carved wood, everything. And on top of that, she would add $2 million in cash specifically for constructing the first academic building. There was one condition, one that showed how radical this decision really was. Matilda and Alfred could live in the mansion for the rest of their lives, but legally, immediately, it would belong to the university. They would become guests in their own home, voluntarily giving up ownership while still living there, to make sure it would be used the right way. Do you understand how extraordinary that is? Imagine giving away your house, the place where you've lived for decades, where your memories live, where your children grew up, while you're still alive, still living in it. Most people can't even imagine doing something like that. The fear of losing control, of becoming dependent, of not being in charge anymore. It's too much. But Matilda did it. She signed the papers. She transferred ownership. And on January 3rd, 1957, it was officially announced Oakland University would be created on the grounds of Meadow Brook Hall. At the ceremony, Matilda stood before cameras and reporters. She was 73 years old by then. Her hair was white. Her face was lined with years of joy and sorrow. But in her eyes burned the same fire that had been there 50 years earlier, when she had been a young secretary determined to change her life. She spoke about her vision, about creating opportunities for young people, about making sure that education was accessible to everyone, not just the wealthy, about building something that would last not just for decades, but for centuries. The newspapers called her generous, philanthropic, a great benefactor, and she was all those things. But what she really was, what the reporters didn't quite understand, was practical. She had solved the problem of legacy. She had found a way to make Meadow Brook matter beyond her own life, beyond her own family story. The crisis of loneliness, the crisis of meaning, the crisis of legacy, she had overcome all of it through this one radical act of giving. For the next 10 years, from 1957 to 1907, Matilda Wilson lived at Meadow Brook Hall while it transformed around her. Construction began on campus buildings. Students arrived, nervous freshmen carrying suitcases, walking paths that had been designed for wealthy guests arriving for parties. The contrast must have been jarring at first, the silence of the mansion interrupted by young people laughing, arguing, playing music, the carefully maintained lawns, now crossed by shortcuts worn by students rushing to class, the sense of it no longer being hers, of sharing it with history and the future at the same time. But Matilda adapted. She always had. She would sometimes stand at her bedroom window and watch the students walking below. She would invite the best students for tea, sitting in the great hall that she had built 40 years earlier, asking them about their classes, their dreams, what they wanted to do with their lives. These conversations must have been bittersweet. The students had no idea who she really was. Not really. They knew she had donated the land, knew she was important, but they couldn't understand the full weight of her story. They couldn't know about the saloon in Detroit, about typing in John Dodge's office, about the fight with Henry Ford, about building the mansion, about losing Daniel. They just saw an old woman who was nice enough to give them tea and cookies and ask about their exams. But maybe that was perfect. Maybe that's exactly what Matilda wanted, to be remembered not for her tragedy, but for what she created from it. Matilda Wilson died on September 19th, 1967, in Belgium, where she and Alfred were traveling. She was 83 years old. Her body was brought back to Michigan for burial. The funeral was held at Meadow Brook one last time. But the house was no longer just hers. By then, Oakland University was thriving. Thousands of students were enrolled. The campus had grown far beyond those first few buildings. Young people from working class families, people whose parents had never gone to college, were getting degrees in engineering, medicine, business, education. The mansion that Matilda had built as a monument to one family had become something bigger, a gateway to opportunity for thousands of families. Today, right now, Meadow Brook Hall still stands. It's been preserved as a National Historic Landmark. You can visit it, take a tour, walk through those 110 rooms. You can see the carved wooden walls, the massive fireplaces, the stained glass windows, all of it maintained exactly as Matilda designed it. Tour guides will tell you about the Dodge brothers, about the fortune they made, about how Matilda built this palace. They'll show you Daniel's bathroom, the ballroom where jazz bands played, the secret staircase in Alfred's study. They'll point out details. This panel came from a house in England. This ceiling was created by a famous Italian craftsman. This stained glass was made by Tiffany. But if you walk outside across the lawn, just a few hundred yards from the mansion, you'll see something even more impressive. Oakland University. Modern buildings made of glass and steel. Lecture halls filled with students taking notes. Libraries where young people study late into the night. Laboratories where future scientists conduct experiments. Art studios where future painters and sculptors create. More than 20,000 students attend Oakland University every year. Many of them have no idea that they're walking on land that was once owned by the Dodge family. They don't know that the library they study in was built with money from selling car parts. They don't know about Matilda or Daniel or John or any of it. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's perfect, because the point isn't for them to remember Matilda. The point is for them to get an education, to build their own futures, to create their own stories. That's what Matilda understood at the end of her life. That legacy isn't about making people remember your name. It's about creating something that continues after you're gone, something that helps people you'll never meet, something that makes the world a little bit better. The tragedy of Daniel Dodge's death, that golden boy who perished in the waters of Lake Huron, was transformed into opportunity for tens of thousands of other young people. The pain that Matilda carried for 30 years was converted into something that creates hope every single day. This is the highest form of transformation, personal pain into public good. Before we close, I want you to think about something. We live in an era where success is measured by accumulation, more followers on social media, more money in the bank, bigger houses, fancier cars. More, more, more. We're taught that the person who dies with the most toys wins. But the Dodge family story asks a different question. What are you accumulating for? What's the point of having more if it all disappears when you die? John and Horace Dodge accumulated millions, but they couldn't buy time. They died young. Their empire sold off before they were even buried. Daniel Dodge had access to unlimited resources, but he couldn't buy safety or wisdom. He died at 25, all that money unable to save him from one moment of carelessness. The only thing that survived, the only thing that still matters decades later, is Matilda's decision to give it all away. That's what changed everything. That's what made the story meaningful instead of just sad. If Matilda had left Meadowbrook to her surviving children, it almost certainly would have been sold, probably torn down, maybe turned into a golf course or a housing development. The carved wood would have been destroyed, the stained glass smashed, the story forgotten. But by giving it away, by donating it for education, she guaranteed that Meadowbrook would survive. And more importantly, she gave it purpose. She transformed a monument to one family's wealth into a tool for thousands of families to escape poverty, to get education, to build better lives. That's real wealth, not the money in your bank account, but the impact you have on the world. Not what you own, but what you give. Not how much you accumulate, but how much you share. Matilda Dodge Wilson proved something that our modern world seems to have forgotten. Aristocracy isn't about blood or birth, it's about character. It's about what you do with the opportunities you're given. It's about whether you use your advantages to build walls around yourself or to open doors for others. She started with nothing. She was the daughter of a saloon owner, a secretary in a factory office. She could have stayed small, stayed invisible, accepted the limitations that society placed on women in 1900, but she didn't. She married John Dodge and helped build his empire. When he died, she didn't crumble. When she became wealthy beyond imagination, she didn't just buy bigger houses and fancier jewelry. And when her son died, when her dynasty collapsed, when everything she had built seemed meaningless, she found a way to give it all new meaning. That's the real story of Meadow Brook Hall, not the 110 rooms or the 39 chimneys or the $4 million price tag. The real story is about a woman who understood that the only things that survive us are the things we give away. The next time you see an old car with a Dodge logo on it, think about this story. Think about the brothers who built an empire from grease and genius. Think about the secretary who became a queen. Think about the young man who died too soon. And think about the mansion that was built as a monument to one family but became a gift to thousands. And then ask yourself the question that Matilda eventually asked herself, the question that changed everything. What will you leave behind when you're gone? A pile of things that your heirs will fight over and eventually sell? Or something that continues to matter, something that helps people, something that makes the future better than the past? Meadowbrook Hall stands today not as a museum to dead millionaires, but as a living reminder that true wealth is measured by what you give, not what you keep. That real power is the power to create opportunity. That the only immortality any of us can achieve is through the lives we touch and the futures we help build. If you're still here, if you've stayed with this story all the way to the end, then maybe you understand what makes stories like this important. They're not just about rich people and big houses. They're about the choices we all face. Do we build walls or do we open doors? Do we hold on or do we let go? Do we live for ourselves or for something bigger? Matilda made her choice. She chose to let go. She chose to open doors. She chose something bigger than herself. And because of that choice, her story didn't end when she died. It continues every time a student walks across that campus, every time someone tours that magnificent house, every time anyone anywhere learns about the secretary from Detroit who built a palace and then gave it away. That's legacy. That's immortality. That's what it means to truly succeed. The story of Meadowbrook Hall is complete, but its mission continues every single day in the lives of young people who will never meet Matilda, but who benefit from her generosity, her vision, her understanding that the best way to keep something is to give it away.